Hey everyone, welcome back. We are in chapter 20, the endocrine system. We are continuing talking about hormones being released from different glands and what they do, as well as looking at their histology and how we're seeing some commonalities. We're seeing a lot of simple cuboidal cells, sometimes stratified, arranged in circular arrangements so that you're releasing outwardly, increasing surface area to the amount of blood vessels that you're releasing to. We actually finished here on slide 14 in the last video, but we're going to start here again on slide 14 because we're looking at how the adrenal gland plays a role here in the endocrine system. It's a complicated gland. So let's look first at how it can be stimulated in one way. We saw that there are neurons in the hypothalamus that releasing hormone into the hypophyseal portal system. That stimulates cells in the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. And adrenocorticotropic hormone makes its way eventually to the outer portion of the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex. It's actually a very specific part of the adrenal cortex called the zona fasciculata. I'll point out what that is exactly on the next slide. Cells of the zona fasciculata release a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol has overall long-term stress effects in the whole body. It can stimulate your brain, stimulate your muscles, stimulate your heart, stimulates everything. Oh, and the specific pituitary gland cells are basophils that release adrenocorticotropic hormone. When we look at the adrenal gland, ad means on top of, renal means kidney. So it's a gland that sits on top of the kidneys. It's named after where it's located, on top of the kidneys, adrenal. When you look at one adrenal gland here, you can see that it has this shape that's kind of just, kind of like a little hat on the kidney. And it has an outer portion and an inner portion. What I'm coloring in green is the outer portion. This is the adrenal cortex. When we look at the histology, here is the portion relating to the adrenal cortex. The very, very outside, like the outer protective layer, that's called the capsule. We'll get to that later. We'll actually get to it right now. The capsule is not a glandular, it's connective tissue. This, and actually spread throughout the organ, if you recall, is that connective tissue proper that's tough yet supportive, provides a good framework. It's reticular connective tissue. So that's a capsule, that's a very outside. The adrenal cortex is towards the middle, and specifically, do you see how we go from really, really dense groupings of cells, all those dots you see are nuclei, to more spread out here in the middle, and then denser again towards the edge? Here in the middle, which I'm going to color in blue, where we see more white space, this region is called zona fasciculata. This middle region of the adrenal cortex is called zona fasciculata, and this is what produces and releases cortisol to produce long-term stress effects. There are other parts of the adrenal gland, and they are completely unrelated to that hypothalamus anterior pituitary zona fasciculata axis. Let's look at these other parts. The outermost portion of the adrenal cortex, I'm going to color it in yellow. The outermost portion of the adrenal cortex that isn't the capsule is called zona glomerulosa. zona glomerulosa. The word glomerulus means ball-shaped. I guess when you look at it closer, you see some ball shapes. But zona glomerulosa produces a different hormone called aldosterone. And aldosterone is a hormone that raises blood pressure. We saw how vasopressin, antidiuretic hormone, raises blood pressure by retaining water from the kidneys. Aldosterone raises blood pressure by retaining sodium ion. When you retain sodium, you actually retain more water. So indirectly, you're retaining more water. And this is targeting the kidneys as well. Aldosterone is produced and released from zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex, and it targets the kidney, tells it to save sodium ion. The other, whoops. The other, darn it. There we go. The other part of the adrenal cortex, which I'm going to color in orange, it gets denser again, those cell bodies. It's a narrow portion towards the middle. This is zona reticularis. We've seen this word before, reticular, very generic word that just means network-like. Zona reticularis has cells that produce hormones called androgens. Androgens, the word andro means male or masculine. Androgen, those are hormones that generate masculine, male-ish traits. On one extreme, if you have high amounts of testosterone, you'll become very masculine. But everyone, regardless of sex, male, female, intersex, produce androgens. Normally, all people produce low levels of androgens from zona reticularis. If you have testes, then you produce even more testosterone. Testosterone is an example of an androgen. So I just want to be clear, everyone, despite the name, everyone produces androgens, low levels here from zona reticularis. And they don't necessarily relate to sexual development. Testosterone can stimulate the brain, can stimulate other organs to do their normal functioning. And we're not going to get into that detail of how it does that. So that's all adrenal cortex. But if you remember, we've actually talked about the deepest part of, take a look over here at the bottom left. We've actually looked at the deepest part of the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, if you remember, let me attempt to draw a brain and spinal cord. All right, there's a brain and spinal cord. If you remember, we learned about a sympathetic pathway. There was a sympathetic pathway that started in the hypothalamus. It went down the spinal cord. Let's say we're at like roughly the T1 level. And then from the spinal cord, we have a preganglionic neuron. I'm going to draw this in blue. Preganglionic neuron that extends to the adrenal medulla. And then from there, we stimulate a cell. These are called chromaffin cells. And chromaffin cells release epinephrine and norepinephrine. So we're getting an interplay here between neurons and endocrine cells again, in a different way from before. We have an interneuron from the hypothalamus to the spinal cord, from the spinal cord out to the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, therefore, is a modified sympathetic ganglion. We saw this in chapter 18. And then instead of having a standard neuron, we have a chromatin cell. It's a special neuron that doesn't have any dendrites or axons and just releases hormone into the bloodstream, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these hormones are for that short-term stress response. When we look at the adrenal medulla, the cells get big again and a little bit darker. When I ask you to identify the histology of the adrenal gland, I will have all 4 parts visible: adrenal medulla, zona reticularis, zona fasciculata, zona glomerulosa, because it's hard to tell when you zoom in on just one. I'll give you all 4 in context, and so you can figure out which region is which, and therefore which hormones are produced in which regions. To recap, the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla. Write that down. Sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. There's other factors that we haven't discussed that stimulate zona reticularis to release androgens. So don't worry about what stimulates it. Just assume that it's going to be releasing it periodically. Adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary stimulates zona fasciculata to release cortisol. And then depending on your blood pressure regulates how much aldosterone is released from zona glomerulosa. Many different hormones released for different reasons from the adrenal gland. Going back up to the thyroid region, the cervical region, take a look at the top right picture. Remember the thyroid? This is an anterior view. You see the mouth, you see the chin, oral, mental regions. If you actually look on the posterior side, like take the thyroid gland and look on the other side, look on the posterior side. On the posterior side, so that's why you see this in dotted lines. On the posterior side, there are these 4 small glands, 2 on either side. Collectively, these are the parathyroid glands. Now they have thyroid in the name, but they have nothing to do with the thyroid gland besides they're right next door. Actually, they have something to do with it, but their activity doesn't, they don't stimulate each other. They're independent of each other. Parathyroid glands, they help increase plasma calcium levels. We actually saw the thyroid gland reduce calcium levels with calcitonin. Parathyroid gland has parathyroid cells that release hormone, parathyroid hormone. They sense when levels of calcium in their blood are low. And what they do is they, in any way they can, they increase levels of calcium ion in your blood. Calcium ion is essential. You need it for your normal functioning of neurons and muscle cells and many other cells. So when calcium levels are low in your blood, you will remove it from your bone. Do you remember which cell removes calcium ion from your bone? You're removing it thanks to those osteoclasts. Parathyroid gland stimulates your intestines to absorb more calcium ion from your diet. And therefore, because of all this, it's an antagonist of calcitonin. It's doing the opposite. When we look at the histology, take a look at the bottom left. We know we're in the thyroid because we see these really big follicles, different sizes, very glossy in the middle, and then simple cuboidal for those follicular cells. And then immediately next to it, we see this huge mass of cells, really dark, just clumped all together. If you see that next to the follicles, that must be the parathyroid gland. And if you zoom in on the parathyroid gland, most of the cells you see, most of the cells you see, the dark cells, those are your chief cells, your parathyroid cells, the ones that produce parathyroid hormone. Fun fact, don't need to know for this class, but you'll probably learn in physio. Vitamin D is a hormone that we can get from like foods. It's been fortified in our milk, for instance, but you can actually make it from the sun, and it acts just like parathyroid hormone to help you increase levels of calcium. That's why they put it in your milk, so you can better absorb the calcium that's in the milk. New organ, the pancreas. You might know the pancreas as an exocrine gland. We're going to focus on this more later when we get to the digestive chapter, but the pancreas is mostly an exocrine gland. It secretes digestive enzymes from cells called acinar cells. Most of the pancreas are these acinar cells. I'll show you what they look like in a second. What we're going to focus on here are its endocrine function. Some of the pancreas is endocrine tissue. The endocrine tissue is made up of things that we call islets, pancreatic islets. Islet, the S is silent, it's pronounced like an island. An islet is a little island. You might see them called islets of Langerhans. I'm going to call it pancreatic islets. These are the ones that produce hormones. If you take a look in this histology, this is an islet. And then surrounding it are the groupings of acinar cells. If you're unfamiliar with the pancreas is, it's retroperitoneal. It's behind the peritoneal cavity. It's in the abdominal pelvic cavity. It's behind, posterior to the peritoneal cavity. The stomach is not shown here, but the stomach would be right, oopsies. The stomach would be right here. So the stomach would lead food into this duodenum, this portion right here. I'm going to clear this. So if this is the duodenum, immediately left lateral is the pancreas. And it's intermediate between the spleen and the duodenum. Let's look closer at the pancreas. The islets, whoops. Sorry, let me show you down here for a second, and then I'll show you the next slide. The acinar cells, an acinus is a group of simple cuboidal cells arranged in a circle, leading to a duct. So for example, here is a cuboidal cell, cuboidal, 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 cuboidal. And then that leads out to a duct. So when you produce and release something, it goes out to a duct. That is an acinus. And so a single cell is an acinar cell. That's what we're seeing here. Groupings of cells in tight circles. What we're not looking for the acinar cells right now. We're looking for cells that are not arranged like that. And that's these groupings of cells that generally look a bit lighter. That is the pancreatic islet. And in those islets, there are two cell types that I'd like you to know. There's actually a third cell type, but I'm not going to ask you to know it. There are two cell types. There are alpha cells and there are beta cells. With the histology that we have, we can't really tell them apart. The pictures you see down here, they've been specially stained so that you can see the individual cells in each example. So like in this one here on the left, you can see alpha cells. In the one here on the right, you can see beta cells. Alpha cells produce a hormone called glucagon. Alpha cells, when they release glucagon, this hormone stimulates the liver and muscles to break down a molecule called glycogen. Glycogen is many glucose molecules put together. So glucagon tells the liver, hey liver, I know you have all this glycogen stored. Take your glycogen, some of it, and break it down into glucose so that we can use it. Glucose is a more usable form. We can use it for energy. We put glucose into the bloodstream, and so you raise your blood glucose levels. This is really useful if you haven't eaten in a while. You haven't had any food, you need energy to keep going, you have energy saved here in the form of glycogen. There's other energy saved in the form of lipids. We're not going to get to that. You'll learn that in physio. But here's a quicker form of energy. If you haven't eaten anything, take glycogen, break it down into glucose. Now you have glucose and use that as energy. And glucagon is what stimulates this process. Now that you have glucose in your bloodstream, whether thanks to glucagon or because you've eaten food, you have higher glucose in your bloodstream, your cells don't immediately take glucose in. Glucose, if you remember, is a non-penetrating solute. It can't just pass through the plasma membrane. You need to put in a special membrane transporter on those cells to let glucose come in. But you don't always have those membrane transporters in the membrane. You need to undergo exocytosis to place them there. To tell your cells to put more membrane transporters, you need another hormone called insulin. Insulin tells your cells to put more membrane transporters in the membrane. If you put more membrane transporters, you can allow for glucose absorption. You bring glucose into cells, your cells can use it. Your mitochondria can use that glucose. Convert that energy into a usable form into ATP and use that energy. So in effect, glucagon raises blood glucose levels while insulin lowers blood glucose levels. They work hand in hand. They don't work against each other. I mean, they kind of do, they're antagonists, but they rely on each other to help your body function properly. You might have heard of insulin because of people with diabetes. People with diabetes, well, there's two different types. Type 1 diabetes, in those people, the immune system attacks beta cells. In type 1, your immune system attacks those beta cells. Beta cells die, so you can't produce insulin. If you can't produce insulin, your body can't really use glucose because you can't put membrane transporters in your cells to let glucose come in. And so now you have to start relying on other things like fats and proteins, which is not good in that proportion. We can talk about this later because this obviously gets more complicated, but that's the beginning of the issue. Beta cells are attacked, they don't produce any insulin. If you have type 2 diabetes, that means you still have functional beta cells. You still actually produce and release insulin. It's the receptors of insulin that are desensitized. Insulin receptors are desensitized in type 2. In type 1, beta cells die. So type 2 can be managed with diet, or on the other spectrum, you'd probably manage it with injections of insulin. People with type 1, you manage that with injections of insulin. You'll learn more about receptor desensitization, sensitivity in general in physiology. You can also hit me up and we can talk about it later. One more gland with one more hormone. The pineal gland. The pineal gland, we're back in the brain. Remember, the pineal gland is just posterior to the thalamus. It's also called the epithalamus, small raisin-looking region of the brain. The pineal gland produces a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin. Melatonin is released at night. So if you take a look at this graph, you see we have time here on the x-axis. At night, melatonin naturally spikes up. And in this time is when we're usually tired. I know there are individual differences and many complicating things that can affect us, like screen time and other things that can keep us awake, stress. Melatonin is normally released at night. And when it's released, that's when we get sleepy, and other things happen at the cellular level that we're not going to get into. But you have this rhythm, your physiological rhythm, that happens in roughly a day. Roughly, approximately, the word for that is circa. Day is dia or dian. So a biological rhythm that happens in approximately a day is a circadian rhythm. The pineal gland releases melatonin at night to regulate our circadian rhythms. It's further regulated by how much sunlight we get. So that's why it's important, if you want to keep a regular schedule, to have sunlight exposed to your eyes in the morning, first thing in the morning. It sends that information to the hypothalamus that regulates your body's biological clock. So that's really what I want to say about the function. Melatonin helps regulate that circadian rhythm, from sleep-wake schedule to when you feel hungry, to when you have to go to the bathroom, to when your cells produce certain genes or produce proteins from certain genes. There's a lot of different things regulated by circadian rhythms. The histology of it, I do want you to identify. When you look at the pinealocytes, it's actually pretty boring. Pinealocyte, it's just a purplish cell with a dark nucleus. Looks like most other cells. So that's really actually hard to identify these cells that produce the melatonin. Funnily enough, though, there are some things in the pineal gland that we get more of as we age typically, and they're not cells. These things are minerals. These things here are minerals. They're called corpora arenacea. Arena means sand. Corpora means bodies. So sand bodies, brain sand, corpora and arenacea. When you see these crystalline structures in a plain looking background of cells, that's a hint to you that we're looking at the pineal gland. These are calcified structures. We get them more as we age. We're not sure what they do. Might figure it out at some point. Yeah. So hopefully you can see how the endocrine system is a lot like airdropping. When you airdrop, you just release stuff to a general spot and hope it gets to the right spot. With the endocrine system, you have hormones that travel through the bloodstream and eventually get airdropped to specific target cells. And these target cells have receptors. Receptors, when activated, cause whatever thing that we want it to cause: sexual development, metabolism, milk production, whatever it's meant for. And it'll only cause that thing if it has a receptor for it. So we saw how prolactin is released into the bloodstream, but really only it goes to the mammary glands. It can reach your brain, it can reach your feet. It's not necessarily going to do anything there because there are no receptors in those places. It'll only have an effect if the receptor is present on that tissue. An idea that you'll repeat more when you get to physiology. All right, that wraps up chapter 20, the endocrine system. Thanks for watching. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'll talk to y'all later.